Paul Froese started with a BA in Russian from Grinnell College in 1990, then added an MA in philosophy in Wisconsin before shifting again to sociology for his 2003 PhD from the University of Washington, where his interest in the sociology of religion naturally connected him to Rodney Stark. Froese started teaching at Baylor University in 2002 while still finishing his PhD, a difficult and tricky combination as I can testify from my own experience. His research concentrates on religion, politics, and history. Each of these dimensions of his work are evident in this 2005 article when he tried to fit this research on Eastern Europe into Stark's supply-side theories, though he found that he had a much stranger, more complicated story to tell. In this region, some ethnic groups actually have managed to realize McNeill's barbarian ideal of the ethnically homogeneous nation. It turns out that when ethnicity can be mobilized and crystallized into a political nation, politics can get tangled into religion in very complicated historical ways, as you'll see for yourself in this article. Okay, I promise that this is going to be about ethnicity in a minute, even though the connection may seem hard to find at first. There seems to be a general opinion, at least in American society, that during the period of communist rule in Eastern Europe, during the second half of the 20th century, the godless atheists running those communist governments pretty much wiped out organized religion. The fact that they failed to do so, as we'll see in a moment, was not for lack of trying either. This is a typical anti-religion propaganda poster from the period, showing a good little communist girl dressed in red, reaching for the modern building labeled Škola or school, while the nasty old woman left over from the bad old days before communism tries to drag her off to church instead. These governments systematically suppressed organized religion, and if you stubbornly kept on being religious, you were not allowed in the Communist Party and so not allowed to rise to the top of society. But as Froese points out for us, as soon as the state socialist system in Eastern Europe finally collapsed of its own dead weight around 1990, lo and behold, religion was right back in business throughout the region. In fact, in several of these countries, particularly East Germany and Poland, the churches actually served as the seedbeds for resistance and reform movements that helped to hasten the collapse of that system. Particularly in Poland, the Catholic Church worked right beside the Solidarity Trade Union and other groups, and when the dust cleared, the ever-present surveys of religious attitudes found that nearly everybody in Poland reported that they belonged to a religion, almost always the Catholic Church. In fact, 2/3 of the Polish population was showing up for church services on a regular basis. Throughout the region, it seems, the church was not dead after all. It had been smoldering along during the communist decades and flared right back up as soon as the chance appeared. Church attendance and religiosity tends to be higher in Catholic countries in general, so Poland isn't so surprising as it might seem at first. In Slovakia, right next door to Poland, and also a Catholic country, we find 2/3 of all people religious, and 1/3 of them going to church regularly in 1990, as shown in Figure 1 in the article. But then we come to the Czech Republic. Here again we have a largely Catholic country, but Czechs reported being the least religious and going to church the least frequently of any country in Eastern Europe. Paul Froese wants to know what's wrong with those Czechs. Why weren't they back in church as good Catholics, like the Poles and the Slovaks? You might well expect them to be more religious than either the Hungarians, who are split between majority Protestant and minority Catholic, or the Romanians, who are nearly all Orthodox Christians like the Greeks, except for a few minority groups. But the Czechs seem to have bailed out on the Catholic Church. This is our riddle to solve. A simple answer could be that the Czech communists were just more ruthless and efficient than communists in the other countries, and did a better job of rubbing out religion once and for all. This kind of explanation would fit well with the ideas Froese encountered from Rodney Stark while he was in graduate school, the notion that government regulations weaken religious competition and so vitality. Those Czech communists might just be the ultimate case of the heavy hand of government causing churches to wither. This argument is a very poor fit to the Czech Republic, though. After all, these are the same Czechs that wanted to start up all kinds of democratic and free market reforms in the 1960s, to the point that the Russian army actually had to invade the country and replace the leaders with better communists. Even after the Prague Spring in 1968, the Czechs were always recognized as some of the least convinced communists in the whole region. So this doesn't look like leaders out to do away with the free market and suppress religion. An even clearer objection to this "the communists did it" explanation comes from the fact that throughout that whole state socialist period, what are now the two countries of Slovakia and the Czech Republic were in fact one single country, Czechoslovakia, and were both governed by exactly the same set of Communist Party leaders. Figure 2 in the article shows that by about 1970, after a whole generation of communist governments in Eastern Europe, all of these countries still reported majorities of their populations who identified themselves as Christians in surveys. The big downturn in religiosity, unique to the Czech Republic, shows up only by 2000, 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the communist governments throughout the region. Even if they wanted to take credit for this lack of religiosity, the Czech communists can't make much of a case that they had anything to do with it. If Stark's supply-side explanation were working here, that communist collapse should have led to a resurgence of religion in the Catholic Czech Republic, just like it did in Catholic Poland or Catholic Slovakia. The trouble is, it never happened. Apparently, the Czechs never read those supply-side articles. After all, the Czechs have been Catholic for centuries, and the Catholic Church in other countries played a central role in bringing down the house of cards when communist governments finally failed. Once the free market sun of competition came out again, according to that supply-side theory, religion should have taken off and become much more popular. Froese brings up an alternative possible explanation, the old demand-side argument that religious competition is actually bad for churches, because it makes people wonder which one is right, or maybe none of them are right. Related to this is a similar argument that when people get richer, more educated, and more content with life in general, they start losing interest in religion. This often goes hand in hand with free markets and competition in general, which seem to be really good at cranking out material prosperity. Maybe the Czechs were just more modern, more educated, wealthier, and so they lost interest in being good Catholics. Two problems face that idea too, though. First, it's awkward to say that in one country, the supply-side effects of the end of communism led to a rebirth of religion, while in the next country over, which actually had been part of a single country with the first one for a long time, the demand-side effects went to work instead and produced a near collapse of religion. This whole supply and demand perspective just doesn't seem to work consistently here, so Froese reluctantly says goodbye to it and tries something else next. When theories of religious supply and demand, which had been so popular while Froese was in graduate school, just won't line up behind the facts in Eastern Europe after communism, he is forced to look around for other explanations. His first stop in this search, quite understandably, is another staple of social science logic, the compositional explanation. When it looks like different groups of people, in this case actually whole different countries, have different levels of religiosity, you might think at first that whatever divides them into groups also explains the religious difference. If we're talking about African Americans in the rural South, in southern cities, or living outside the South, religious differences might be due to something about those locations themselves. In this case, when we're talking about Czechs and Slovaks, it might be something about those locations as well. But in both cases, a good social scientist checks for alternative explanations before leaping to such a conclusion. After all, it could really be that living in modern cities, where people get more education and lead more prosperous lives, makes you less religious. Maybe the Czechs are just more modern and prosperous than the Slovaks, and also the Poles for that matter. Maybe if you were to look only at educated, prosperous people in the big cities in each country, you'd find exactly the same amount of religiosity. The composition of the population in terms of education, income, places of residence, and so on, might be the real explanation. So Froese looks up the facts and figures about Slovakia and the Czech Republic, and we find these in Table 1. We know that women are often more religious than men, so maybe there are more women in Slovakia and more men in the Czech Republic. This is a long shot, given the constant human-sex ratio, and we have to toss that one out immediately when we see that 52% of the people in each country are women. Well, we also know that people may be more religious at older ages, so maybe people in Slovakia are older. No, it turns out we can toss that one too, because the average age in the Czech Republic is actually a couple of years older, so this explanation is going in the wrong direction. We also find that sometimes more educated people tend to be less active in churches, except for those African Americans in their semi-involuntary institution of religion, though. But this also is no help at all in the case of the Czechs and Slovaks. The average age at leaving school, which is a reasonable proxy for how much education you get, turns out to be virtually identical in both countries. This shouldn't surprise anybody who remembers the tremendous drive for free universal education that was one of the central policies of communist governments, determined to wipe out the old social class divisions in society in that respect. As far as he can find information about it, Froese also has to conclude that we can't fall back on different occupational mixes for the labor force of each country, because there again we find nearly identical figures for both. The only time we see any difference is in the size distribution of communities. A larger share of people in the Czech Republic live in big cities like Prague, and fewer Czechs live in tiny villages compared to Slovakia. This possible explanation is set up in the right direction to explain more religiosity in Slovakia. So again, like a good social scientist, Froese feeds all this information about different possible compositional differences into one big statistical model predicting religiosity, and then cranks the handle to see what will come out the other end. In his Table 2, Model 1 on the left shows the huge deficit of religiosity in the Czech Republic compared to Slovakia, with nothing else taken into account. Since we already know that there was no difference in the sex ratio, and that the Czech Republic was actually a little older, his Model 2 doesn't help at all. We see that men are significantly half a point less religious than women in both countries, and that religiosity is indeed positively related to being older, but this just makes the original difference between Slovakia and the Czech Republic even bigger after we take age and sex into account. Another fact that Froese includes in his model is whether respondents reported that they had a religious upbringing when they were children themselves. Based on everything we know from other sources, this should turn out to be pretty important. And based on Table 1 that showed more people in Slovakia reporting such religious childhoods, we should get some real mileage out of this one. Indeed, the coefficients for this question are the biggest positive numbers in the whole table, confirming that childhoods did matter in Central European religious life too. But what kind of explanation is this? We know that more people reported religious childhoods in Slovakia, and that such childhoods worked in nearly identical ways in both countries, strongly predicting adult religiosity. But this still leaves us with the fundamental contrast between the two countries, just pushing that contrast back from the present to some earlier time, when Slovakia was already more religious than the Czechs in the western half of the former Czechoslovakia. This is still a country-based explanation with nothing in it about supply and demand or social composition of the population. To make matters worse, adding this item in Model 3 still leaves about half of the Czech religious deficit unexplained, and still due simply to being Czech. So something about being Czech in the past combines with something about being Czech in the present, in both cases making you less likely to be religious. We know that it's not age or sex, so in Model 4, Froese adds in all the other compositional factors he could measure, including the categories of size of place that look like our only realistic possibility for a compositional effect. Unfortunately for the compositional explanation, none of these other possible explanations are any help at all. A higher age at leaving school does predict a very slight tendency to be less religious, but since school leaving age was virtually identical in both countries, this can't be much help. Occupational differences had no significant effect on religiosity, and neither did the size of the town where you lived. Compared to the biggest cities, some categories of towns were less religious, and some were more religious. all within the bounds of what could have been random noise given the very large standard errors reported for these categories. So after all this fancy statistical dancing, Froese is left with no better explanation from the compositional analysis than he could get from the supply and demand logic with which he started. He has learned, though, that some intrinsic difference persists between Slovakia and the Czech Republic, a difference that was already visible when these respondents were children, and which they have maintained and perhaps reinforced slightly since then. Since he now knows that this contrast, whatever it is, goes back at least a generation or more, he decides to look back for possible historical explanations. Since this article does eventually come to an end, just like all the others, we can guess that Froese does finally find something that satisfies him as an explanation for the low level of Czech religiosity. While he relies mainly on reports by people about how strongly they feel about religion, this Czech religious deficit shows up no matter what kind of questions you ask. If you ask about identification with some organized religion, the Czechs are off the charts saying that they do not belong to any such groups. If you ask how often they go to church, lots of them don't. If you ask them about saying prayers or other personal religious questions not directly connected to participating in formal public group rituals, they still won't bite and remain distinctly unreligious. Froese finally concludes that to understand this strange situation of a whole country full of lapsed Catholics, we need some historical perspective. Up through the first quarter of the 20th century, both of these territories that today are independent nation-states were just provinces or districts within the vast Austro-Hungarian Empire, which covered all of Central Europe until it was destroyed in the course of the First World War. To understand the religious riddle still plaguing this article, we have to know some crucial facts about this now extinct hodgepodge of an empire. Within its boundaries, Austria-Hungary included many different nationality groups, or what we should recognize for present purposes as distinct ethnic populations. They were divided by languages, histories, and in many cases also by religions. Some territories of the empire were populated by Italians, by Croats, by Serbs, by the Magyars of Hungary, and of course including the Slovaks who now live in Slovakia, and also the Bohemians and Moravians who are now called Czechs. Parts of Austria-Hungary were also composed of Ukrainians and some Romanians. When we call these groups nationalities, we need to recall that using the word nation in this sense refers to an ethnic group that is attempting to mobilize and crystallize itself into a self-governing political state, organized by and for that ethnic group as a group. The history of the past 100 years, since the collapse and fragmentation of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, has been one long story of a dozen or more of these ethnic groups persistently sacrificing their blood and treasure to achieve that barbarian ideal of the ethnically homogeneous nation that William McNeill wrote about. More than ethnic groups in almost any other part of the world, these tribal independence movements in Europe have been largely successful. As a result, there are all kinds of little countries all over the map of Eastern Europe today. In each one of them, there's usually one dominant ethnic group, and unfortunately, there are also some leftover bits of ethnic minorities from other groups that may be crowded into awkward corners of these countries. Once in a while, one country or another will decide to treat these minorities badly in some way. But this is only to be expected when the country was created in the first place to celebrate and empower a particular ethnic group. You only want to live in one of these ideal barbarian nation states if you belong to the ethnic group that got together and made it a country for themselves. This history of an empire dissolving into ethnically homogeneous nation states is only one piece of the puzzle of the secular Czechs, though. The other thing you need to know about Austria-Hungary is that it actually had two capitals, Vienna and Budapest. Under this unusual arrangement, the western parts of the empire, including Bohemia and Moravia, were governed by the authorities in Vienna, while the eastern provinces, including Slovakia, were governed from Budapest. For hundreds of years, this was no problem because the whole empire was a strongly Catholic world power. In fact, the Austro-Hungarian Empire formed the front line between Central Europe and the Balkans to the southeast. On the other side of that boundary, another empire, the Ottoman Empire, had been pushing its way into Europe and even invading Austro-Hungarian territory, trying to spread Islam into Europe. When the Austro-Hungarians defeated the Turks at the gates of Vienna and began to push them back into the Balkans, church bells rang all over Europe, and Beethoven even wrote a symphony about it. But then the Protestant Reformation came along, and one of the places it established some roots was in Hungary. Before long, the Protestants ended up in control of Hungary. When you add this change to all those ethnic nations battling to turn themselves into countries, lots of other things start to add up as well. For example, the imperial Austro-Hungarian rulers in Vienna, the famous Habsburg dynasty, were Catholics all the way. When the Bohemians and Moravians got started on their ethnic crusades to become independent of the imperial overlords, even though these Czech lands, as they're called, were also Roman Catholic, the context of being controlled for so long from Vienna made them look at Catholicism as Austrian religion. When you're struggling to get away from Austrians, it's harder to get excited about the religion dictated for you by Austrians. They did not become Lutherans or start a Czech Orthodox church. They did not become Buddhists. They were still Catholics like always. They just can't get too excited, says Froese, about Austrian religion now that they have their own barbarian ideal of an ethnically homogeneous nation, and the empire is no more. In contrast, since Slovakia was governed under the empire from Budapest, the rise of the Calvinist Reformed Church in that country meant that the imperial overlords for the Slovaks turned out to be Protestants. Almost all the leaders of the Hungarian independence movement in the mid-1800s were Protestants. So when the Slovaks got started on their quest for their own barbarian ideal of an ethnically homogeneous nation, they actually could turn to the Catholic Church as a way of resisting those Protestant overlords in Budapest. By being Catholic, a Czech person in a way is giving in to the imperial past, to what was once both religious and political control from Vienna. But by being Catholic, a Slovak person is standing up against the religious and political influence from Budapest and championing one's own ethnic independence. This example of the secular Czechs and devout Slovaks, in addition to being a fascinating little mystery to solve, also gives us a glimpse of the difficult issues that can arise if we go down that path of not only recognizing but championing group rights for ethnic groups in addition to human rights for individuals. After all, the right to form a whole country dedicated to just one ethnic group is pretty much the ultimate group right that any ethnic group could dream of. Just be careful what you wish for.